Hey everybody, so this is episode 7, part 5. It is in the second voyage that we see so many of the people that most Dominicans born and raised on the island know, like Caunabo, el hermano de Ana Caona Vecchio. These are the people that show up in the second voyage. But in the second voyage, we also meet the Caribs, and they were actually the second group of Native Americans to directly attack Colón. But there was one Native American that really caught my eye, and she was the first documented victim of SA. I'll write it somewhere around here what that means. And I wanted to share her story first. So this is the second part of my series on the hidden legacy of the Taino and Taina warriors of 1492. It's around November 10th, 1493. Colón had departed Spain on September 25th, 1493. And he had already stopped in Gomera in the Canary Islands. And he was heading really lower south of where he wanted to be. Because even though he was an expert navigator, he didn't always get it right. He had spent 6 months in Spain gathering his finances and supplies in order to get on this second trip. Because he didn't take the same route he took on the first trip, he actually ended up further south. And in these islands that he began to discover was actually populated Caribs tribe. The Caribs terrified the Tainos because they ate people. We have historical documents both from the Spanish, the English, the French dealt with them more, that described the Carib practices. They had the tendency to raid Taino villages, kidnap the women, enslave the women on one island, take the men, cut off their private parts, and put the men on a separate island. So along the way, Colón finds many Tainos who have been kidnapped by the Caribs, and they beg him to please take them back, to please take them off the island. So on November 10th, Columbus's fleet, he had on their second trip 17 ships and more than 1,000 people. He had the first horses, cows, sheep, goats, and pigs and chickens that would end up in the New World. He also brought food that was not native to the Western Hemisphere, and that's where we get a lot of the foods that we eat now, like garlic and onions. So on November 10th, he was still on the island that we now call Guadalupe. He was sailing about northwest along the coast of the island of Montserrat. He had already rescued a good amount of indigenous people from these various islands, and through Diego Colón, he was able to somewhat understand that the Caribs had ravaged these islands, and they supposedly had eaten all of the inhabitants. And Ferdinand Colón, or Hernando, whichever one you prefer, Colón's son, lets us know some of Colón's feelings at this time. He writes, Columbus was so anxious to relieve the men he had left on the Española that he decided to just continue sailing and not stop at any more islands. So even though Colón did not want to stop at any more islands, he was met with a storm on November 14th. So he directed the 17 ships to seek refuge or shelter in Salt River Bay, one of the islands that we now know as St. Croix, or the U.S. Virgin Islands. So once the storm had passed over, some of the men decided to go ashore. And the onboard physician named Chanca, he actually wrote about what happened. He said they went out to learn what kind of people lived there, and also because we needed information about which way to follow. Because remember, even though El Indio Diego Colón was with Colón at this time, he wasn't familiar with this part of the Caribbean. He notes that on this island, as well as in the other islands that they had stopped, most of them were women on this island, and they were prisoners of the Caribs. The men headed back, and then Colón decided to send out another group of men. And the purpose was to capture a local Indian who knew that part of the Caribbean. The group of men he sent out actually returned, not with another Indian guide, but with more women. It is said they returned with several indigenous women and 3 children. They placed them into their boat and headed towards the boats that were anchored offshore. But then they found themselves in a battle against a canoe that had 4 men and a woman. Colon's men carried these wooden shields because they had already learned about all the arrows that the indigenous people would throw at them. And that one woman in this Indian canoe proved herself to be an amazing archer. She was able to pierce their shield. The Spanish became extremely angry at this, obviously. So their idea was to ram themselves against the canoe. This managed to topple the canoe and dump the indigenous people into the water. But then something just amazing happened. The indigenous people that were in the water, the Caribs, they continued to shoot while swimming. And their arrows were not just typical arrows. These arrows were dipped in a special kind of poison. We now know that the poison was derived from beach apples, or manzanillas de la muerte, as the Spanish called them. Oviedo states that these apples were so poisonous that if a man would lie down to sleep for only an hour in the shade of one of these trees, he awoke with his head and eyes swollen and his eyebrows level with his cheeks. And the Caribs were not just satisfied with this type of poison. They actually mixed las manzanillas de la muerte with toxins or poisons from snakes and other insects. Even the leaves of this apple bush were so poisonous that the Caribs used it to poison their enemies' water supply.